Nobody's born a bigot. And if you want to know if you're a bigot, ask yourself, what am I willing to believe about this group?
Caller, you are live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hey, guys, it's Rev Robbins over here in North Carolina.
Hey there. How are you?
Rabbi, whenever I was a little boy, my mom used to read me Bible stories, and one she would always focus on was the story of the Good Samaritan. And she always told me to be a good Samaritan and show mercy and compassion and love everybody. And whenever I was a minister for many years, that's the way I had always preached it when I talked about it in the book of Luke. And now that I've turned from those ways and I've renounced Christianity, that story doesn't seem as wholesome as what it was whenever I was a kid. If you could just explain, why, what was the purpose of the Good Samaritan if it wasn't to, just show everybody to be compassionate and loving? And thank you so much, Rabbi, and I love what you do.
Okay. Thank you. And go ahead and hang up now and tune in for your answer. Rabbi.
The story of the Good Samaritan is a nightmare for Jews, and it's found in Luke chapter 10. And it's a parable about a person who is going down from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not super high altitude. It's not like the Himalayas or anything. But Jerusalem is, let's say, 2,700 feet above sea level. It's up there. And going down to Jericho. Okay. Here's how the story goes. There's a man who's laying on this curved road, and he's in a lot of trouble. And along comes not just a Jew, not just any Jew, but along comes a priest. And the priest sees the man. He's in a lot of trouble. He's laying there on the road. Something is terribly wrong. He needs help. And the priest, the Jew, the super Jew, goes, ha, and keeps walking and does nothing to help this person who appears to be in desperate need of help. I'll explain to you why later I added in that modifier. Then comes the Levite. Again, this is not any Jew. This is a person who's from the tribe of Levi, also a person who has who possesses a unique ecclesiastical role for the Jewish people. Okay, and the Levite looks and moves on and does nothing to assist the person who appears to be in a lot of trouble. But there was the Samaritan in verse 33 of chapter 10 of Luke. And the Samaritan sees the man on the road, cares for him, takes care of his wounds until the person has recovered. What a nightmare of a story. Now you're going, well, what's the deal? Who's the Samaritans? So today, the word Samaritan just means a good Samaritan. It means a good thing, right? And who are the Samaritans today? Well, there are probably about 1,000 of them in the world in a few cities here in Israel. But the Samaritans in the temple period, in the second temple period, even in the first temple period, were a big problem for the Jews. The Samaritans came into the land of Israel through the Assyrian Empire. When the 10 tribes were carried off by the Assyrian Empire, the Samaritans were the replacement group that came into Israel, and they were pagans and sought to convert to Judaism because they were being attacked by lions. The point is that their conversion to Judaism was very much insincere, was for all the wrong reasons, and their conversion was not accepted, and they became the problem people. They did whatever it took to impede the building of the temple. They rejected the notion that Jerusalem was, in fact, God's holy city. That's going to come up in the book of John with the Samaritan woman, because the Samaritan woman says, well, which is it? In a conversation with Jesus, she goes, which is the holy place? Is it Gerizim, as my fathers say, or, Jerusalem? And Jesus says to her, don't mess with the Jews. Salvation is of the Jews. What they have is correct, right? They're not the best, but that's where salvation is of the Jews. So it's important for you, in order to grasp what's going on in Luke, is to depart the 21st century and enter into the first century. In the first century, the Samaritans were the people who were the problem people for the Jews. So they weren't Jews, but they were Jews wannabe. And they said, we're the true Jews. And it was a nightmare. I'm not going to go through all the stuff, but they created big problems for us. They were a nightmare. So when you contrast the behavior of a priest and a Levite with that of a non-Jew, but it's a Jew wannabe, that's the ultimate attack against the Jewish people. The point of the Good Samaritan, to anyone who actually reads through this parable, is to convey that this person was not even Jewish, whose fathers are wrong, but they care about people. They have more passion about people, and they have more. There's more in them, and the Jews are just cold-hearted. You have another parable of the 10 lepers that will come up 7 chapters later in Luke chapter 17. And the lepers are healed, but only when the Samaritan comes back to express his understanding that it was the glory of Christ. That means the Samaritan is the good guy better than the Jews. That's the ultimate put down. So unless you know that, you don't understand what Luke is doing here. Do you see what this does to good Christians? Do you understand how a good Christian, a person who is otherwise completely moral, would have an uncharitable view of Jewish people? This is why I like Christians, because I used to think that Christians were insane and bad people, and I didn't like them, and I just wish the world was rid of them, because they brought about everything from the Holocaust. I was born only 15 years after it. All the misery and anti-Semitism. I thought Christians were insane. When I began to read the Christian Bible, I went, holy smokes, these people are good people. The only thing is their minds are filled with the storytelling and parables that are found in the Gospels in particular, because that's what the storytelling is. And the storytelling fuels the anti-Semitism and the bigotry. I mean, how are bigots created? The way it really happens is that it's through storytelling. You don't produce bigots by just saying, oh, black people this, or Eskimos are this, or Hispanic people. No, you tell stories about them. That's how, if you want to produce a bigot, that's how it's done. Nobody's born a bigot. They're told stories in their home about whatever, fill in the blank, and then they begin to dislike them. And if you want to know if you're a bigot, ask yourself, what am I willing to believe about this group? Ordinary people don't act the way Kanye West does. I mean, that's crazy stuff. Ordinarily, the way people express their bigotry is like, what are you willing to think? What could you believe about a specific group that you would not believe about another group? That's how you know that you're in a lot of spiritual trouble, okay? So that's the story of the Good Samaritan. That and all these other stories found throughout the Gospels all color the Jew in the eye of the Christian in a way that's very unfavorable. You do have to understand what a Samaritan meant in the first century. What did that mean? It meant that was the anti-Jew. Okay, you got that? Now, no one feels that way today. Today, there are, maybe 1,000 Samaritans in the entire land of Israel, and today they're like a museum piece. There's no antagonism between them and Jews here in Israel. People go to see them because it's something from the past, a relic of the past. And they're actually struggling to preserve themselves because they're basically assimilating, disappearing. And I know some Samaritans who've converted to Judaism. How interesting is that? Now I want to tell you something very, very special and very precious. So one of the things that I might do when I'm walking, I like to exercise and to walk, is I like to listen. And I like to listen to very powerful things. And Dr. Martin Luther King, a blessed memory, who was murdered in Memphis in 1968, his speeches were remarkable, just remarkable. He was a devout Christian, and he loved Jews. He didn't just like Jews, he loved them. He had an affection for Jewish people that is shocking, stunning. He also, as it turns out, his speeches are loaded with quotes of the Hebrew Bible more frequently than other preachers would. So he's a very, very striking figure, a brilliant man, and he had a tremendous love for Jewish people, just tremendous love for Jewish people. That's really very striking, very striking. In his last speech that he gives before he was murdered in Memphis, it's very famous because in it he essentially anticipates that he's going to be killed. That means I might not get there with you, meaning the promised land, but it's going to happen. Okay, very famous because if I had only sneezed. Those of you who've listened to this very important speech, he was stabbed by some very deranged person, and it's a very beautiful story that he could have been killed at an earlier stage, and so much he would not have witnessed so much. But at the end of his life, he was being threatened up and down, and he had a very strong feeling he might not make it. So he's sort of speaking from the mountaintop. Okay, why am I going there? So I listened to that speech more often than most rabbis do, I think. And he talks about the story of the Good Samaritan. And you go, well, how did Dr. King understand that? I mean, here's a person who's, how did he explain it? He had such an unbridled love for Jews that he understands it. He has to then explain, well, why did the priest and the Levite ignore the person who's lying in the road? And he actually describes his own trip to the land of Israel and him traveling with his wife on the road, on that curvy road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And he describes this in his speech as what probably happened was the priest and the Levite who passed the person on the road must have assumed that person, that injured individual, was feigning an injury and really wasn't injured, but rather bandits, in order to lure in a potential victim, would feign injury, and then only once someone would come close, then the bandits would capture him, and then the person would lose everything and possibly lose their lives. And King assumed that that's probably what's happening in Luke chapter 10. And I think it's worthwhile to mention that because he just was able to not see the hate, but rather see love and look at the story in a way that really very few Christians do, and he conveys that in his second most famous speech. Thank you very much for your question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא עובר והוא יהיה